In this episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to share with you how to draft a Peter Pan collar, so stay tuned! Hello and welcome! I'm Akram Tagaby-Burrett, and you're watching Akram's Ideas, bringing creative and crazy ideas to life. In this episode, I'm going to share with you how to draft a Peter Pan collar for any neckline. Now, as you can see, I'm actually wearing the Megan dress from the Tilly and the Buttons Love at First Stitch book. And in that book, Tilly goes through some processes of adding some embellishments to the Megan dress. But one of the things that I really wanted to put on my Megan dress was a Peter Pan collar. To see more episodes like this, be sure to click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to get notified of new videos. Just like I've done here. So there's no instructions for this in the book, but there are lots of tutorials talking about how to add a collar to a neckline. So I did a little bit of research and I came up with the method that I used for creating this collar. So I'm going to share with you how I measured the neckline, drafted the collar, sewed it all up, and put it together. So with that said, let's get started. To draft our Peter Pan collar, you're going to need a couple of things. First off, you're going to need your front bodice pattern piece and your back pattern bodice piece. You're also going to want to have the seam allowance marked along the collar and the shoulder seam on both of those. And you can see here that I've just done a line at the 5/8 inch mark here. You're also going to need some tracing paper like this to trace out the lines for our pattern. You're going to need some colored pencils or writing utensils of some kind. I've got two different colors here, one for the pattern piece and one to mark the seam allowances. You're going to also need a French curve. This is just going to make it a lot easier when we create the little Peter Pan collar roundedness. And to hold it together, I've got some painter's tape here so that I can tape the pattern pieces together while I'm tracing. So the first thing you're going to do is decide how you want to assemble your Peter Pan collar. Now, some Peter Pan collars actually do have a side seam on the shoulder. But I find that traditionally most Peter Pan collars are all in one, so they come all the way around, and depending on the pattern, if there's no back closure, they actually go all the way around the neck and they just are separate at the front center. So our Megan dress has a back closure, and because of that, I'm going to draw the collar pattern piece from the center front all the way to the center back. So I'm going to draw it as one piece. So I don't want any shoulder seams for the collar. So that is why we have actually marked our seam allowances on the bodice pieces. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take my bodice front and my bodice back, and I'm going to line up the shoulder seams at that marking that I made right there. And I'm going to take a little bit of painter's tape to just hold these pieces together while I trace the collar outline. Just like so. Now I'm going to take my paper here. This is my tracing paper. And using my pencil, I'm going to draw an outline following the curve of my collar here. So I've got that done. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mark that 5/8 inch seam because this is my stitching line, okay? Now what I want to do is I want to determine the shape and the height of the collar. And that's where the French curve comes into play. So I can kind of play with, you know, how big a curve I want. And I can, you know, I can draw this a couple of different ways, play around with it. Now, as we're drawing our curves and stuff, I'm gonna put a couple of pattern weights down so that I don't accidentally move my tracing paper as I draw. So again, I'm gonna kind of play with the shape, and you might have to do this a couple of times to get the shape that you ultimately want. And I pretty much just kind of eyeball this a little bit, kind of coming in here and kind of like, how big do I want this? How deep of a curve do I want? And the French seam is actually a really nice tool for doing these kind of curves. That looks about right. So I'm happy with that. Now, I have done this a couple of times and I've gotten the shape all right just to sew it up and realize, you know what, I didn't draw the pattern with the seam allowance. So it's got the seam allowance here. So keep in mind this is actually going to look like this. So if I draw my seam allowance on here, actually only going to be this big in height, but I still need the seam allowance for the actual outer rim as well. So I'm going to go ahead, so I'm going to use my French curve again, and on this French curve I have my 5/8 inch marker. So I'm just going to put my 5/8 inch along that shape of the collar, and I'm going to draw out my seam allowance off to the edge here. Now, technically speaking, I don't have to make this 5/8 of an inch. It could be a 1/2 inch, I could make it a 1/4 inch, I could even make it 3/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch. It just depends on what you want to do. For me, making it 5/8 of an inch makes sense because the rest of the pattern is at 5/8 of an inch. And then I don't have to remember, like, did I make that a 1/2 inch? Did I make that a 1/4 inch? You know, what was my seam allowance? Granted, I'm gonna write it on the pattern, but I'm just gonna stay consistent. Notice that I did not add, I've extended past the front edge, but I have not done anything to the back side of this. And that is because I've actually still have my seam allowance in this back center back. The front, center front, has no seam allowance because it's on the fold. So because of that, I actually need to add seam allowance to the front piece of the Peter Pan collar versus the back piece of the Peter Pan collar. So I do extend out on the front, but not on the back. So now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and take my scissors here and cut out this collar piece along the orange. And the orange extends past the actual pattern piece, so that is the seam allowance. And I'll go ahead and unstick my bodice pattern pieces. Oops. Hopefully, the painter tape should do a good job of coming out pretty easily without too much problems. There we go. Okay, so I'm through with the bodice pattern pieces at this point. So here is my piece, and I'm going to mark it that I have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm also going to say what it is. So it's a Peter Pan collar for the Megan dress. And how many I'm going to need to cut. So obviously here's my pattern piece. As you can see, I'll need to cut 2 for each side, but then I also need to actually cut 4 because I'll have an under collar and the over collar. And I'm also going to need to cut 2 of interfacing because the upper collar is going to be interfaced to let it set a little bit nicer on the shirt. So I'm going to write those on here. So cut 4 fabric, cut 2 interfacing. Alright, so before I cut out my fabric, I'm just going to do a quick test and make sure this all lines up. So I'm just going to bring it to the dress here and take a look at how it's setting. Now keep in mind the actual pattern is going to go to the green line here, so it's actually going to be more like that. And it looks like it fits pretty spot on, and the center front is aligning up. So now that I've got this, I'm going to cut out my fabric and my interfacing. So I have my fabric that I'm going to be using for my collar, which in this case I'm using some white cotton as a contrast to the lovely navy and white heart fabric that I'm using for the dress itself. So I've got this folded over, salvage ends together, so I've got it folded once, and since I need 4 pieces, I'm just going to fold it a second time. So now they should have four pieces here. And I try to do this so that I waste as a little fabric as possible when cutting out these pieces. So I want the stretch of the fabric to go along here, so I'm going to cut it out just like this. And I'm going to use some pins to casually get this to hold down in a few strategic rotations. With a curved pattern piece like this, I prefer to use my rotary cutter, and I've got this really tiny one here that is perfect for going around small curves. And I'm just going to cut this way so I can get that excess off. You will, if you're cutting multiple layers like I am, you want to make sure that you have a nice sharp rotary cutter. And so now I have the 4 pieces of fabric cut. I need to cut 2 of the interfacing. So now I have all my collar pattern pieces set up. I've got the 2 under collar pieces that have no interfacing and the 2 upper collar pieces that have interfacing, and I'm going to sew them right sides together. So I'm going to take these 2 here like so, and my fabric doesn't actually have a wrong or right side, so I'm not going to be too picky, but the interfacing, as you can see, is on the wrong side, and then this is going to be the right side together. And I'm going to pin along the outer edge. So I'm going to do that for both collar pieces, and I'm going to sew that 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around this outer edge of the collar. So as you can see, I've sewn my 2 collar pieces together, and what I'm going to do now is on this outer edge where I've sewn them together, I'm going to trim the seam allowance. And I actually like to use my pinking shears to do the trimming on here. So I'm going to trim back to about 1/4 of an inch on the seam allowance here. So I've trimmed it with my pinking shears, and one of the reasons I like doing this is then I can take my tiny snips here and I can clip the curves on the every other little indentation on the pinking shear triangle. And I also find that using these tinier shears to do the clipping, you can get in there at pretty close without going past the stitch line. Once I have it trimmed and clipped, you're going to go ahead and fold your collar back to the right sides out. When you are sewing your outer edge of your collar, be sure to also sew the back end of the collar piece too. So you've got that sewn in at a 5/8 inch seam allowance and trimmed off as well. So you've got the entire collar piece around the outer edge and sides all sewn up, trimmed, and pressed. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take the inner collar piece, now that we've turned it right side out and pressed everything, we're going to take this inner collar piece and just base stitch it at that 5/8 inch seam allowance. Alright, now it is time to attach our collar pieces. So I have base stitched them together at the top here, and the inner face side is going to go face up. So this is going to be the face up side. Now, I have made some markings on the dress. The first marking I've made is the center front, which is where the front of these, or the, they're going to match up right there in the center front, just like so. The other marking that I've made is the 5/8 inch mark on the back of the dress. That's where they're going to end. So I'm going to come up here and match those up. Same thing on this side. I'm going to match it up with that 5/8 inch piece. Now keep in mind that this 5/8 inch piece here is actually going to be folded in for the zipper, so it won't extend past the collar. Now that I've got those pieces, I'm just going to do some pinning along the edge of the collar here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the sewing machine, stitching along that same base stitch that I did on the collar. I'm going to baste the collar to the dress. Alright, so now that our collar is basted on, we're going to go ahead and add in our facing. Now I have sewn the facing pieces together and finished them with my serger at the ends here. And if your pattern, for whatever reason, doesn't have a facing piece, you basically can draft it very similarly to how we drafted the collar pieces. Typically, facings have the shoulder seam, and then obviously it'd be one piece for the front center there. But the same method, you just measure out the collar based on the bodice pieces. So this dress does have facing pieces. Now what we're going to do for here is that the right sides are going to be put together. So my facing pieces are going to come over the collar like this, and we're going to sew everything, and then the facing is going to be folded into the dress. So the most important thing is that you have your facing pieces, if I turn this around, lined up with the very back edge of the dress, because those pieces do line up. And then the next thing that we're going to make sure that we have lined up is the side seam. So I'm going to pull up my piece here and make sure that I do in fact have my side seams matched up correctly on this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew this just like we sewed on the collar. We're going to sew at 5/8 inch seam allowance. This time we're going to use a standard 2.5 stitch length. Alright, so now we have our collar and our facing attached to our dress. What we're going to do now is we're going to trim the seam allowance, but we're also going to grade the seam allowance. And what that means is that the seam allowance that we're going to see on the top, which is the dress itself, is going to be trimmed at a larger size so that it hides all the other seam allowances that are shorter. So basically, we're going to start by getting the seam allowance for the facing and cut that at the shortest trim here. So we've got the facing done. Now we're going to trim back the collar pieces, and we're going to trim that back so a little bit sticks out over the facing bit. I like to use my pinking shears for trimming. This means I don't have to worry about these edges fraying either. And so the very last bit here is our dress piece, and we're just gonna again trim it so that it is a little bigger than the collar piece, but it's still being trimmed back ever so slightly. So here you can see the different levels. I've got the smallest level here, which is the facing, the level of the collar, and then the dress level. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to my iron, and I'm going to iron the facing down just like so all the way around. So now that we have the collar pressed and everything's looking really nice, but what we're going to do now is we're going to ensure that our facing doesn't want to peek out and stays laying flat. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the sewing machine, and on the inside we're going to top stitch the seam allowance down towards the facing, and this will ensure that the facing will stay on the inside of the garment. As you can see, I really love this dress. Not only do I just love the Megan dress, and I've actually made 2 more since making this one, I love all the little embellishments that I added to this particular one. I added rickrack on the sleeves, I added the cute little heart buttons on the top here that are just decorative, but I think what really makes this dress is the adorable Peter Pan collar. Now, this method for creating the Peter Pan collar I've used lots of times, and it's always seemed to work really well. And of course, you don't have to use a Peter Pan collar. You can always do a pointed collar or a variety of other things. I'd love to hear in the comments below if you have any tips or suggestions for drafting your own collar, or if there's any other tutorials that you'd like to see on Akram's Ideas. As always, thanks for watching.
In this episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to share with you how to get that. All I need is So I'm going to share with you how I put. What was my stomach making all that noise? My goodness.